Very much, Gary. Thank you, Director Inglis. My name is Megan Stifel. As Gary started to allude to, I'm the Chief, no, it's too close, Strategy Officer at a nonprofit called the Institute for Security and Technology. And we are delighted to be here co-hosting-ish this afternoon with Gary. I want to say thanks to Laura as well. And of course, thanks to Microsoft, my dear friend Sean Farrell, and others for giving us this opportunity to talk this afternoon. I want to build for a moment. Well, I think the whole point of this afternoon is to continue to build. So we are going to scale the conversation, and hopefully this conversation will then lead to scaling of the topic that we're talking about, which is public-private partnerships. I also want to sort of begin by acknowledging that I hope that our successors 10 years from now, and hopefully it's not 20 years from now, are not confronted with this issue as much as we are today for two reasons. The first of which is that we have achieved a marketplace where products are coming more secure to market. So there will be hopefully fewer need for public-private collaboration of the type that we think we need today, which is more of a disruptive nature. And the second is that we will have succeeded in evolving this conversation. I agree with Director Inglis. I think we're not exercising this as well as we could be. With that, those kind of as moderator's prerogative, I'm excited to be here with my esteemed former colleagues. They're going to introduce themselves, and then we're going to kind of have a three-part conversation. So immediately to my left.
Okay, I'm Steve Kelly. I'm the Chief Trust Officer at the Institute for Security and Technology. So Megan and I currently work together at IST. I was in government up until about a year and a couple of months ago. I was retired as an FBI special agent and spent a couple of tours doing policy work on the National Security Council staff. And so that's actually the reason why I was asked to be part of this panel. Is I was in the room when we were cooking up some of the text that we're going to talk about in the National Cybersecurity Strategy around operational collaboration and having worked in this space at the FBI on both cyber crime and national security threats. Got a bit of a front row seat as well. So look forward to the conversation. Megan, thank you for moderating, and over to Nick.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Megan. Thanks to American for hosting us, and IST and Microsoft as well. I'm Nick Leiserson. I'm an Assistant National Cyber Director at the Office of the National Cyber Director. I long ago made a vow never to follow Chris Inglis speaking, and yet here I am. So check that off as, never follow Chris because he says everything so perfectly, and then you have to try and clean up. But thank you, Chris, for your leadership and for the opening remarks today. I was also part of the team that was working on the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the implementation plan, working closely with Steve when he was at the NSC. So happy to sort of talk about some of the vision there. And before joining the White House, I was on the staff of Congressman Jim Langevin for 11 and a half years, working on a whole host of cyber issues for him, including the Cyberspace Solarium Commission that talked about this issue a lot as well. Sean? Excellent.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and our hosts, WCL and Microsoft. And Megan, thanks for being this panel. As a WCL alum, it's nice to come back to see the old stomping ground, though it's much different than the WCL I went to, which is about half a mile down the road here. So I am currently the chief of the National Security Cyber Section at the Department of Justice. It's a brand new section, been in existence only since August of last year, which is designed to bring forth a body of prosecutors to focus on the national security cyber threat. Prior to that role, I have been working national security cyber threats since 2010, starting out as an intelligence lawyer, and then was brought into the prosecution world in 2014. Prior to that, when we were developing the first case against the 5 members of the People's Liberation Army that we eventually charged in 2014. Since then, been working to disrupt the national security cyber threat, which mostly fits with the state sponsorship is how we would define that. It's not perfect boundary since then, but at the time of the development of the national cybersecurity strategy, I was in the Office of Deputy Attorney General as the Technology and Cyber Counsel for the DAG. And in that capacity, I had the front row seat at the development of the national cybersecurity strategy and helped kind of corral all the various parties of the Department of Justice to provide input in that strategy and its implementation plan.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen. So first I want to set the stage, or help us set the stage. So we're going to go back a little bit. I have a bit of a Wayback Machine here. Of course, all of us were 12 when we were working on national security policy, and now we're only 30. So, anyways, several of us have known each other for longer than we probably all want to admit. I've probably said that too many times lately, but it remains true. So particularly this, I'm going to start with Steve and Sean and think back to sort of life pre-National Cybersecurity Strategy that was issued last March. Thinking about investigations at that time and thinking about the extent that we can talk about them, operational collaboration of a public nature, and what you saw as kind of successes in those events, those collaborative moments. Of course, if you can't find any, I have follow-up questions. So
I'm sure we can find a few. So in terms of a frame, through, for instance, FBI's cyber program started formally. It was a memo in December of 2001, kind of cleaving off a piece of counterterrorism division, criminal investigative division, and some others, creating the formal cyber division and cyber program with FBI, and the call out to create squads across the country to work on these problems. So, it was not very long, into that process that there was recognition that to work and to solve some of these complex cases, both on the national security and the criminal side, that the people that are sitting on the information have the visibility into the threat actors and perhaps are even in a better position to act than even the federal government or the private sector. And so over the course of the decades, there's a number of wonderful examples of where this marriage between the Bureau, and I know this probably goes as well with U.S. Secret Service that has a great cyber mission, and the private sector to work together around some of these common problems, that there's great examples of how that came together. And oftentimes at the center of that was a couple of, well, three at least ingredients, is you have an investigator who is, or a case agent who is, talented on the subject matter, motivated, a collaborator in terms of their personality. Usually, in all cases, you have a U.S. Attorney's Office that has that's forward-leaning and has an assistant U.S. attorney who's willing to take those cases and to be creative, and then private sector entities that are willing to work with them. And so those magical ingredients come together, and then in other cases, it crashes and burns. And oftentimes there are, these are too personality centric or personality based. And so that's why there's a few folks in here and perhaps online that experienced the great successes of the Pittsburgh FBI field office with U.S. Attorney's Office there. And there's like great examples of why are all the major cases coming out of 2 or 3 places? It's because those ingredients existed together. And so then the question is, how do we bottle that? And so that has been the age-long struggle. On the national security side, which I'll hand this over to the baton over to Sean to talk about it. It's even more complicated because some of the information that feeds into the investigation is necessarily classified or even more highly sensitive. And so it's very difficult to pull off a disruption activity. And then maybe one last little kind of nugget is getting aligned on what we're trying to accomplish is oftentimes a huge challenge. And so that's one of those things that can cause a collaboration to fail, because law enforcement may want to do this. They may want to work on it for a long time, identify the subject, charge them, and then take the long game and try to get that person into custody. Whereas a company may be like, I've got customers that are being harmed. We need to act more quickly. And these two things might be mutually exclusive. And so the question is, how do you find common ground to work towards a common outcome? And so I think a lot of progress has been made since those early days. And we've seen examples of that, but it still seems a bit anecdotal, which maybe I'm getting ahead of myself in terms of why the text of the strategy reads the way that it does. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Sean for kind of case examples of what's been great.
Yeah, Steve, you hit it on the head. I think kind of what I was going to speak about to this was if you go back to, like, let's say the 2010 to 2018 time period, it really was personality driven at the various locations where you saw this collaboration coming together in a successful manner. I think in a lot of places, at least in the national security space, that was actually allowed, though, to hit a point that Steve mentioned, by the fact that at least the FBI and the Department of Justice, we were chasing a lot of these actors with unclassified legal tools, legal process that allowed us to get information back that was unclassified. And I think it actually opened the door and opened up some of the flexibilities to allow some of these personalities to say, I no longer have to jump through all these hoops to try to share this super sensitive information. I now have this body of unclassified, law enforcement information that I can share with whoever I want to share with because it's mine and I got it in my own legal process. That really, I think that shift and starting to use that unclassified investigative approach provided some tools to those personalities to allow them to start engaging with private sector partners and achieve some of those successes that you were pointing to. I mean, I think to one that I always like to point to, and it's an oldie but a good one, is there's a group APT 41, a PRC-based group. There was a prosecution brought out of the District of Columbia with the FBI, WFO, the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, National Security Division, where I like to think that was the first time they threw the kitchen sink at one of these groups. We recognized they couldn't arrest. They were, at least some of them, they were sitting in China. They're continuing to conduct their state-sponsored, espionage in some cases. Sometimes they were gathering information to line their own pockets. But in that case, you had a personality and the prosecutor, you have personality agents that came together and they partnered with a bunch of entities in the private sector. I want to say there were 5 that were allowed to be named publicly, a bunch more that said, don't name us. We just like to work behind the scenes. And they were doing, infrastructure takedowns based on terms of service, based on legal process. I think Microsoft at the time pushed out software patches. At the same time, there was an indictment being unsealed to expose them and their connections to the Chinese government, as well as arrests overseas by Malaysian authorities in Malaysia. And so it was a really good example of all these different groups coming together in 2021 to have a 2020, to have a success. But again, it was personality driven at the time. And I think we work towards, and we'll get into this more, is trying to bottle that, as you say, I like the term, and to get it out of that into more institutional space.
So far we're following the doctrine, or excuse me, the 3-part test almost laid out by Director Inglis of people. So personalities were largely part of the keys to success. Some doctrine, which it sounds like a bit of a shift from dealing perhaps very not routinely with classified information and trying to collaborate with the private sector with information that was protected, to maybe a shift to leveraging unclassified information. But Nick was in a very different place at the time. As he mentioned, he was on the Hill. So I'm very curious to hear, because unlike some of us in the Department of Justice, not everyone followed the interagency process rules. And some people may have been up on the Hill talking about interagency collaboration and public-private collaboration. So not naming any names, of course. Nick, what did you hear? What did you observe, if you didn't hear anything, about kind of how you thought we at the time in the executive branch were managing this risk and opportunity?
Yeah, it was something we heard a lot about, I think. I mean, it was helpful to be working for a congressman who spent a lot of time thinking about the issue, because people would naturally gravitate towards who would take your meetings. And it was like, we were complete suckers. If you had a cyber topic, we would always take your meeting. So we heard a lot from both, well, actually from all aspects of the community, right? From companies, from security researchers, and from government officials about challenges. And some of the challenges, I think, we've already started to hear alluded to, right? One of them is, how do you institutionalize some of this behavior that is driven by personality? Something great happens and you're like, oh, what's the next step? And it's like, well, the next step is that person moved to a different field office, or the threat actor that we have as a priority, they're really more Russia people, and these folks are actually based out of somewhere else in Eastern Europe. I don't know. So institutionalization was certainly a problem. Another problem was communication, right? And I think that's a theme that you're going to hear me come back to a lot today, of like, both there is a core challenge of how do we make sure that interests are aligned, and as Steve alluded to, that what the government's interest is, what the private sector's interest is, or security researchers, that the ways to actually effectuate, we're all interested in taking down the bad guys. That's not the question. The question is, what are the steps that we need to do to get there, and over what timeline, under whose authorities? Even if your broad strategic goal is aligned, that doesn't always mean that in a particular case that's aligned. But even before you get to how do we ensure there's alignment, a lot of frustration that we heard on the Hill was from both sides saying, these folks don't understand us, right? That security researchers come to the table and say, I have information, I know those are bad guys, you're the government, you have absolutely infinite array of authorities and power, make them disappear tomorrow. Bad things are happening on the internet. You should do something, which is, of course, not realistic at all. And on the flip side, that, you know, the government is sometimes a black hole. We call them up. We say, hey, you know, something bad is happening on the internet. We think you should do that. We hear, oh, thanks very much for your interest in national security, and never hear anything back. And people say, oh, this is very helpful. Like, we need the private sector input to effectuate things, but there's no feedback loop. And if you are just sending things up into the void and sharing with folks at DHS or DOJ or wherever it may be, that you're not actually seeing how the government is using that, which can be very frustrating. And so that was one of the core pieces, I think, that comes across often in the community, and it's on disruption activities, certainly, but, you know, even in 2015 and 16, NTIA was doing a lot of work with vulnerability disclosure policies, and they had a multi-stakeholder process to look at how do we develop a model one. And for some reason, Megan, to your point, Alan Friedman was like, oh, it'd be great to have someone from Congress here. I don't think his Office of Legislative Affairs approved of that, but just seeing that process play out, right? One of the things that was very evident from all of the work that we did was, at its core, the best way to improve vulnerability disclosure policies and processes is to set clear expectations up front and communicate frequently. And when you do those two things, that sets the groundwork, that sets the trust environment so that collaboration can happen. And challenges with communication were probably the top thing that we were hearing, certainly on the Hill, while from the, you know, the scope of what we saw in Congressman Landrigan's office.
Thank you. I also had the note in there, which I'm going to say, you were a terrific partner at the time when I was allowed to talk to you, which wasn't very often. Anyways, we've heard a little bit about some of the pressure points that led, I wouldn't say led to, but Steve in particular and Sean will help us decide whether they led to this particular pillar of the strategy. And for those of you following along in the papers, we're talking about pillar 2 and its strategic objectives. So we're on page, we were talking earlier, 13-ish of the strategy. Steve's got it over
15.
here. Well, 15 is where we're going to get to your Shakespearean moment. So
Hard light, but yes, okay.
well, to me, it's like Shakespeare. The three of you then, so we're, the three of you were in the roles we just discussed. We now all change roles, or most of us change roles. And so we're going to talk a little bit now about kind of the drafting of the strategy, and what was taken into consideration when you all were thinking about how to draft the strategy, the particular elements to pull together, and how you engage with some of the stakeholders. Nick identified a few of them, who I think in this particular issue set play a very critical role that we still haven't figured out how to leverage, which is the security researcher community. So I'm mindful that I'm not exactly sure which act of the strategy drafting, Nick, you came in, but whether it was like part 1 or scene 1 with the drafting, or scene 6 with the implementation plan, but artfully you were there. So in thinking about kind of pillar 2, what was top of mind? You mentioned communication, you mentioned prioritization and expectations. How did you approach the writing of this pillar?
Yeah, so I think the details of what gets hashed out in pillar 2 are Steve and Sean are going to have a lot more expertise of what is going back and forth in the editing floor. What I can say is, how do we think about framing this in the broader strategy, right? That I think is sort of what, if you look holistically at the strategy, you say what we keep coming back to in terms of what is this administration's vision. There are 3 things that I boil the strategy down to. First, we're building on the work of the past, and that means partnership is foundational, right? We trace back actively in the strategy all the way back to the Clinton administration, the Presidential Decision Directive 63, and we say partnership is one of the things that makes cyberspace interesting from a policy standpoint. It is foundational to our success. It is a 100% a point of continuity between what we're doing in the 2023 strategy and the work that's come before, but there are 2 areas where we need to see significant change, and the government needs to act to see the change that we want to see, to live in the world that is described in the front matter of the strategy. So we start with an affirmative vision. We say 3 core things we need: partnership, but then 2 strategic shifts. And the strategic shifts are, 1, that we make investments in long-term cybersecurity and resilience, but 2, that we place more of the responsibility for cybersecurity on the more capable actors in the ecosystem. And, you know, Megan, you mentioned one example of that, right? Which is, how do we ensure that the products that we're using, the technology on which we rely, is more secure by design? What are the incentive levers we can pull for that? That's a core element. But another core element is the idea that the government is one of the most capable partners in cybersecurity. And if you look at Pillar 2, public-private collaboration is key to it, but in many senses, Pillar 2 is the most federal government-oriented of the pillars, in terms of saying there are things that we as the government, we have unique capabilities, unique authorities to do. And as part of our responsibility to the broader ecosystem, to take more of the responsibility upon our own shoulders, this is the kind of things that we need to do. And the focus there is dismantling and disrupting threat actors, right? And that was an area where we said the locus of responsibility needs to start with the federal government because of the authorities. But since Chris was leading the effort to draft this, and you heard him earlier say, you know, division of responsibility is not the way we're going to win this. Collaboration is a shared mission. That's why the focus of what you see in Pillar 2 is, yes, we're starting from the proposition that we cannot simply win, we cannot simply achieve the president's vision by just saying to folks who own and operate networks, it's on your shoulders. At the same time, if we're going to achieve what we need in our ability to disrupt and dismantle cyber threat actors, we need to do so as a collaboration jointly. That's the strategic framework for Pillar 2. And then within that, you know, I'll just speak very briefly about the first 2 strategic objectives, from how do we think about the problem, because those first 2 in particular are very closely intertwined, which is, how do we integrate federal disruption activities, which are manifold across many different agencies? And then how do we do the same with private sector partners, with folks who are non-governmental entities, and how do we ensure collaboration? That's kind of the big picture framing of, like, how does Pillar 2 and those 2 strategic objectives fit in terms of the specifics. You know, Steve, I know, was spending hours and hours thinking about all of this language, as was Sean. So I'll let them pick up the story from there.
So can't jump the gun.
Sorry.
So you mentioned collaboration. Obviously, Nick is still in the Office of the National Cyber Director. Steve, at the time, as he mentioned, was sitting in the National Security Council. They do collaborate. Steve, this is your chance now to talk about your Shakespearean moments. And I think really help kind of drill down on some of the language that's there and why it's there, thinking back to some of the pain points that you and I and all of us at the table experienced pre-national cybersecurity strategy. So what's in there and why?
Yeah, happy to. And again, credit to our colleagues, Rob Kanaki and Harry Kreisa and Matt Farron, who really did lead the drafting. And I was kind of helping on the side, and we got there. So it was actually a great effort. So one piece that's worthy of kind of articulating before we even get into the exact text and how it's structured and what it was calling for is this strategy. Almost nobody noticed this, but declared that ransomware as a threat to national security. And so at the time, and including to this day, you know, we're seeing ransomware affecting hospital operations and other critical infrastructure. And it's a pretty bold statement to say that has risen to a level as to constitute a threat to national security, because it also is a pretty significant signal within the apparatus of the federal government of what tools might become available to deal with the problem in the same way that the global war on terrorism brought all tools to bear, diplomatic, military, intelligence, law enforcement, economic, everything. Sending that signal is a kind of an organizing principle for the U.S. government, and it's also a message to other countries. It's a message to the bad actors as well that the gloves are coming off. And so with that said, in Pillar 2, which is entitled Disrupt and Dismantle Threat Actors, there's two bits. One is strategic objective 2.1 is on integrating federal disruptive activities, and that gets into this all tools of government kind of requirement, and it leads off with talking about how the Department of Justice does things on their side in terms of bringing evidence collection and disruptions against criminal actors, and it brings in as well talking about cryptocurrency seizures and then also victim notification, which gets into, I think this was an allusion to some of the things that were happening at the time with the FBI having penetrated some ransomware gangs infrastructure and being able to then pass out very quietly decryption keys and that sort of thing, and then bringing in sanctions designations, diplomatic actions, and intelligence operations. And then in the next paragraph, it even goes so far as to talk about bringing in the Department of Defense's Defend Forward mindset. So this is kind of like, we need to bring all these tools together to disrupt the threat actors. And it's pretty important also that this is a signaling a disruption of mindset. In the traditional way of a criminal investigation, it involves collection of evidence and doing things very quietly and building a case. And then when you have enough to charge the actors, then that becomes public, and it could take a year and a half or longer. But in the case of threats to critical infrastructure, this disruption mindset is recognizing that we can't really wait a year and a half to start taking action because there are actual victims, additional victims being harmed. And so these are some of the signals that are being sent and the policy being articulated. And then as we get into strategic objective 2.2, which is enhancing public-private operational collaboration to disrupt the cyber threats, this is calling for the overcoming of some of the common obstacles that exist. There's some interesting parallels to, and there's a resemblance between the text that appears here and actually a World Economic Forum report that was published in 2020 on operational collaboration to disrupt cybercrime, where in that report, it articulated this concept of this node and cell structure where you would have an organization, like a standing organization, perhaps a nonprofit organization like the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, which is specifically named in that report, and actually in the National Cyber Strategy as well, as being a host of these threat-specific operational, or the threat focus cells is the term that's used, borrowing from some terminology that the FBI had used for a couple of generations. But some of the key ideas here are that perhaps the collection of actors that might be able to have visibility into a threat, perhaps even take action on it, might be a little different from threat to threat. And so this coalition of the willing of folks that have visibility, have the ability to act, and are motivated to come together in a trust group to address a particular issue, that is an idea that's baked in here, and that there needs to be some sort of infrastructure to support that. And it also describes these as nimble temporary cells. I'm reading from the National Cyber Strategy, but actually I think that there's very similar language in that World Economic Forum report as well. And so getting to Director Inglis's point about the types of individuals and organizations that might be part of an effort against a particular threat actor, it can be U.S. government agencies, U.S. companies, it can be foreign companies, it can be foreign agencies, it can be law enforcement. Very commonly, he had talked about the Five Eyes intelligence relationship with the English-speaking countries, but then also the Germans and the Dutch team High Tech Crime are very in this hunt. And so there's this option of really pulling together a broader set of stakeholders that are in a position to act on something. And so the structure needs to be flexible enough to accommodate them. And this is where some of the governmental structures, where perhaps you have the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, which has standing members, companies that are signed in to be able to do sharing, that works great, but there might be a player out there, a security researcher that's independent or a company that you wouldn't normally partner with that perhaps has that unique insight that we want to bring into that conversation or into that activity. And then similarly with the Cyber Collaboration Center at the NSA, that's a highly vetted group of industry stakeholders. There's a lot of opportunity to grow that, but still that's a trusted environment sitting in a SCIF, or at least having the ability to interact in that context. This oftentimes, the types of organizations and individuals that might want to come into a collaboration around a particular problem could more resemble that bar scene from Star Wars, where it's kind of a motley crew of folks. And that might be what's necessary for a particular activity. And so getting those people together, taking care of business, and then disbanding that at the end, and then moving on to the next problem with ideally an operational outcome that happens way faster than a traditional 18-month law enforcement investigation. So getting into how do we take a shot? Because we've got to stop these actors from taking advantage of the next victim. So these are some of the things that came into play. And Sean, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that as well.
So Sean, I know that DOJ loves to work with motley crews of people who resemble humans and non-humans alike.
You work at NSC and ONCD.
Right. But I in the outline I was sort of had outlined this as you kind of be on the receiving end, but that's not fair. That being said, as opposed to kind of the locus of collaboration, interagency efforts being in the NSC and ONCD, you were in the DAG's office, the Deputy Attorney General's office at DOJ. And so that is a particularly unique position within the interagency process, within the executive branch, given the role that DOJ plays in ensuring public safety, conducting investigations, and helping secure the nation. So what were you kind of most optimistic for in the drafting of the strategy? What were you most worried about? How do you think it went? Anything more that you're hoping for or would like to see?
Yeah, I think I'll stick with pillar 2. I mean, and especially on the public-private collaboration aspect of it as well, and interagency collaboration, because I think those generally go to the theme of today's get together. But I feel like maybe I'll be interested in talking to our colleagues at ONCD at the time, Harry and Rob, but I think maybe there was some trepidation coming into pillar number 2, and those two in particular with regard to the DOJ FBI position, but I do think that was in large part maybe based upon some outdated notions of kind of where we stood on this issue of working together with our partners, or we're in the private sector, and kind of picturing us more like for the FBI, we got it, let us do our thing. We're the only ones with this authority. So actually, I think the pillar 2 came together, and I think this obviously is a testament to the folks at ONCD who are corralling everyone together, but it came together, I think, very easily. And from DOJ FBI perspective, absolutely no concerns whatsoever with how it started coming together and where it ended up. In fact, I think we actually have a document that probably isn't widely known, but it's public. It's the DOJ's Comprehensive Cyber Review Report, and it's something that our current Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, she called for when she first came onto the department beginning the administration, which is let's look at how we're doing cyber. Let's make sure we're doing it the right way. And I think if you take that document and look at how we kind of frame the use of all government tools, the use of private sector tools, and the collaborations, and you put it up next to those pillar 2, especially 2.1, 2.2, if I'm getting the numbers correctly, you're going to see almost precise alignment. Maybe not the same words are being used, but just the themes are all in alignment. And that comprehensive cyber review came out about a year in advance of national cybersecurity strategy. And we have in that document 6 pages devoted towards lauding the value of public-private cooperation between law enforcement and the private sector in disrupting cyber threats, which I don't think you would have found in any pre-existing DOJ document up until that time. So at the end of the day, I say it was very easy to pull this together from DOJ's perspective. we were already, I think, very far along in the interagency partnerships that were called for in 2.1. I couldn't think by about 2022, I'd be hard pressed to give you an example of some sort of DOJ FBI action that didn't also have 2 or 3 federal partners involved in the same activity, whether sometimes it was public, sometimes it wasn't, and that's just the nature of the business. But that was always step number 1, was seeing which U.S. government partners can we align with on this to have a maximum disruption effect. And sometimes, to be honest, I think the DAG has used the fast athlete analysis or analogy. Sometimes we did these big investigations and realized we didn't really have the tool to bring to bear. And so we just basically took all of our information and just handed it over to some other U.S. government partner to take the action. And that was all stuff that was starting to percolate out throughout the Department of Justice, probably about the 2021, 2022 timeframe, through us bringing together all the prosecutors in the department who are working these threats, going to all the FBI conferences and talking to the agents about how we want to approach this. On the private sector collaboration, in 2.2, I think for us, it was very important that we point to some of the successful forums. And that's why I think NCFTA got a shout out in there, and rightfully so, for the work it had been doing in that space already and for years, particularly on the criminal side of the house, not so much on the national security side of the house. But it was important for us to kind of point to them as an example of where there's been success already in establishing these hubs. But we also did want to, for the points you raised earlier, Steve, leave room for more flexible coalitions to come together to work on a specific problem and to disband. And I think we found more success with that latter model with the threat intelligence companies. My personal theory is maybe there's more concerns in that space about sharing information with a competitor. If you can't get a bunch of threat intelligence companies together and they all put on the table everything they know about APT, insert your number, because they see some of that is how they pay the bills by selling the threat intelligence. But if you get those groups or 1 or 2 of those entities together against a specific threat that they have a lot of insight to, you could really do a lot of damage to the actor set. And so I think that is kind of the context where we saw these nimble ad hoc groupings that could come together for one specific disruption operation and kind of go and separate and go on their merry ways was really effective and didn't necessarily fit the hub model. So I think that's why we liked the fact that there were 2 different models were talked about in 2.2 as being effective when it comes to public-private collaboration.
I'll offer a 2-finger on that. And so that is a kind of a key theme is an organization doesn't have to be a member of a particular club or organization to be able to participate in a threat disruption activity. Under this concept being that there may be a hub organization like an NCFTA that's well postured to facilitate a collaboration around a particular threat actor or problem set. And that can include members from within their ranks. It can include organizations that are outside of the membership of that particular organization. I think that's necessary. Otherwise you're missing opportunities to get to folks that might be able to be put onto that problem. The thing that Megan was referring to in terms of my Shakespearean moment, hardly Shakespeare, but the last sentence of this particular strategic objective reads that the federal government will rapidly overcome barriers to supporting and leveraging this collaboration model, such as security requirements and records management policy. Yawn. That sounds so boring, but it is just amazing how often, kind of standard policy and practice cannot be overcome, or it takes so long to get the approval necessary to do something. Like something very similar, very, very simple, like who's going to run the Slack channel? Well, where are those records? Are they available for litigation search, for a FOIA search? Can you get special dispensation for that to live over here for 6 months while that happens, and then that's brought into a system of record? You could completely kill an opportunity around some of these very boring and common hurdles, which is why it's necessary to create a construct, to create the policies and the practices that allow this to happen, and have that already queued up in advance so you can be nimble and stand up a collaboration around something that needs to happen. And so I'm sure that that's probably something that is happening through the implementation process, which I'm now on the outside, so I couldn't tell you where that stands, but I hope and trust that that's proceeding, and perhaps Nick can speak to that one.
Yes, great. So we've talked a bit about what preceded the strategy. The strategy is now, we've talked a little bit about its drafting. we're going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about sort of the process going forward and pave the pathway for some of our forthcoming panelists, including someone from NCFDA and a few former U.S. attorneys and the like, who can talk about what they've been experiencing day to day. Before we get there, though, so sort of fielder's choice here. I don't know, Nick, you might have some news to break, but I'll give you that a minute to collect your thoughts on that one. Sean, you talked a little bit about kind of the pillar coming together very well. Can you share a little bit more about kind of some of the how DOJ has operationalized the strategy? Perhaps your role being one visible action, public action from that new role, not new role, new name.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think one thing that we've done and is really try to ensure that this idea of operational collaboration with our U.S. government partners, our private sector partners, or our foreign partners, which I haven't mentioned yet, which again, I think Chris, you mentioned, was extremely important. We've really tried to ensure that's all ingrained in the DNA of not only the agents who are working this space, but also the prosecutors. And maybe some folks, I think, might have considered that second category to be more of the stodgy, like resistant forces in that space. But we're really, I think, especially with this newer generation of prosecutors that are coming through DOJ who are working cyber matters, I think it's now successfully in their DNA that they, whenever they're opening an investigation, the end goal is not to get a shiny indictment that you talk about while the actors continue to hack from wherever they're at around the world, but to throw a wrench in these actors' activities as early as possible. We actually have put in DOJ policy that prosecutors shall, at every stage of investigation, evaluate options for early disruption, even if that means making eventual arrest of the perpetrator much more difficult. It's in policy. I've actually pointed that to several times in my history. I won't name anybody, but saying, no, you shall do something now and not wait for 2 years because this actor set is a problem. And I point to the APT 41 example earlier on purpose, anticipating kind of closing out on this, is back in that time, I say we threw the kitchen sink at these actors. We did it 2 years into the investigation, wrapped up at the very end when you had the charging document, you had some arrests overseas. We wait for that time period to kind of take down a lot of their infrastructure. I think now, fast forward to 2024, all that takedown, that disruption stuff is going to be happening like on a regular basis, kind of mowing the lawn, so to speak. You're never going to cause these actors to stop what they're doing. They can reestablish infrastructure. We're really looking for that sweet spot where it takes us less work and more work for them to reconstitute. And if we can find that, that's when we're going to start taking action right away. And we're pulling together multiple conferences a year, bringing in our prosecutors and having them just listen to case studies. That every single case study they're hearing has some aspect of a private sector, international, or U.S. government, or all the above partnerships in them, and really driving home that point. I think I'll just point to as an example of this, and I'll turn over the floor into the time. We've had this year, we've done out of national security cyber section and DOJ with FBI and private sector and foreign partners, I want to say, 4 large technical disruption activities targeting malware networks or botnets operated by nation state adversaries. There's more in the hopper as we speak. And one thing that has been key to all those, and I can point to, is there is a private sector partner involved in every single one. And there was an international partner, sometimes dozens of international partners involved in every single one of those. And we're really pointing to those as kind of the success and the gold standard of disruption. And again, if you point and you look behind the scenes on all those, sometimes it's going to be public, sometimes it's not. There were partners, multiple partners behind every single one of those. And we're really internally driving home the point when we bring people together for our big conferences or in internal messaging, that that's the way it needs to happen going forward.
Congratulations. It's definitely a pivot from where things were a few years ago. So looking forward to working with you all to keep the numbers going in the right direction on that space. Nick, most of us are familiar with the implementation plan. If you're not, you should be, everyone. There's a lot in there for interested parties. Maybe the section that we're talking about is not quite as dense as the others. No criticisms, of course. What do you think has sort of been significant in can you elaborate on what is there in terms of Sean's articulated some of DOJ's shifts? How about the rest of the interagency?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, first of all, like one of the things I think, if you look at the goals, right? And I'll talk about two of them, right? First, let's talk about institutionalization of some of this, right? To how do we move from ad hoc to a repeatable process where you're still going to need to draw from different experts. You're still going to have different folks in the private sector with expertise, security researchers, whatever that may look like. And, Sean is not bragging about himself. So I will brag a little bit about Sean because his role is in the implementation plan. If you look at how DOJ is talking about institutionalizing what we call in pure Washington good policy wonkery bureaucraties, organizational platforms. If you see the word organizational platform in the strategy or the implementation plan, Sean here is an organizational platform. This is and again, like to his point earlier, this is the Deputy Attorney General. She is driving this. She is driving that language being included in the strategy. She is capturing this from her work in 2022, saying this is a priority for her. This is a priority for the Department of Justice. And there is going to be a cyber section in the National Security Division, right? And it is going to be resourced as it has in the president's budget request. That is what institutionalization looks like. And that is how you can ensure that the very great successes that Sean is talking about, right, carry on. Because if it's just tied to Sean, that's great. And may he stay very long connected to this community, et cetera. But what you need is the institutional platform that the cyber section represents to be able to do this. So full kudos to what the work that is going on right now, building that within Department of Justice, taking this section that didn't exist as of August of last year, and now has institutional successes to point to and continuing to build on that. That is what institutionalization of this work looks like. And that is not necessarily hugely transparent, right? I mean, there's a reason that it's very Washington bureaucratese in terms of what's the language we're using. It's because we have to organize for success in some ways, and we are doing that. But the other point that I will now come back to, and as you alluded to, Megan, right, like what's happening today on the communication and the trust point. So trust is critical to the success here, right? And we heard that from Director Inglis. I think that his example of, how is it that NSA and GCHQ work together is extremely illustrative of there is just a fundamental level of trust. And from that trust is built the collaboration. And one of the things that is core to trust is communication. Also accountability. That's why we publish the implementation plan so that you can all see this is what we're thinking about and say, hey, send us more ideas because version 3 will come next year. So, you want to see more on this stuff, please send us your ideas. But communication is foundational to building that trust, right? Is to be able to set those expectations. So it's National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, as I'm sure everyone in this room is well aware. And earlier today, Director Coker, early this afternoon, in fact, just put out a blog post talking about how do we engender some more of that trust with our partners in the community. And one of the ways that he was focused on, and that is really tied into some of this work as well, is use of the traffic light protocol. Which again, if you're in the cyber community, you're like, right, TLP, yep, got it. And if you're not, you kind of scratch your head and say, what the heck is it that folks are talking about? And one of the pieces of feedback, one of the ways that we approach problems at ONCD is we listen. We listen to our partners in the community. We listen to our partners in government. We listen to what are the challenges people are having. And one of the things that we heard is we share information with the government with a TLP marking on it, and we're not really sure what that means within the government. And, there's some asymmetry there, right? When the government says, we've given you a clearance, you've signed an NDA, you've signed many things in blood. And if you share any of the classified information that we're giving you under these auspices, you might go to jail. And obviously, there is a reason for that asymmetry, but we want to be clear in our communications with folks about like, what are our what can you expect from us? And what the director says both in the post and kind of a statement that we worked with partners in the interagency, like the Department of Justice, like the FBI, like CISA, like the DOD, et cetera, is what you can expect, which is to say, we are going to respect the TLP markings that you have put on whatever piece of information you're sharing with us, right? So except where it's in conflict with existing law and policy, and the examples there, like think of CISA 2015, which is the Cyber Information Sharing Act, and the statutory exemptions of saying, hey, is there something that you're telling us that is TLP red, but is actually about an ongoing threat to someone's life? We're not per se going to respect that. But beyond that, like the expectation that you should have is that we take this seriously. And it is a message both for our private sector partners who will engage in such collaborations with us and whose work is fueling the investigations that Sean is talking about, but it's also something that folks in the cyber community can point to within the government and say, no, this is why this is important. This is a core foundational element of the trust that we rely on to build these partnerships. So that is something that, again, when we look out and say, how do you engender success in this space? Part of it is absolutely institutional, but part of it is cultural. Part of it is changing the way that we approach these kinds of problems. And that starts from saying, we trust that our interests are aligned and that we are all coming to the table in good faith to address these problems, even though we're bringing different priorities. It's something that the National Cyber Director, Harry Coker Jr., Chris's successor, also spoke about at DEF CON this year, is like, we need to do a better job of starting from a standpoint of, we're all here in good faith. That doesn't mean our priorities align perfectly, but if you start with that level of, yes, I trust that you're coming to the table, you're clearly communicating to me what your intentions are, what the limits of your authorities are, but what you're trying to do, from that comes great things. And so that is, again, like one of the other areas that we have been emphasizing, will continue to emphasize as we go forward, will be critical to success on any of this collaboration work with the private sector.
Thanks, Nick. I want to commend you and the team on that. I think to selfishly, shamelessly plug some of IST's research. So one of the things that we're known for as an organization is establishment of the ransomware task force, which we did in 2021 and have produced a number of research products since that time, one of which is around public-private partnerships. And one of the observations that's made in that document, kudos to Elizabeth Fish on our team and Gigi, who are not here. Hopefully they're listening remotely. And I should also know that work was undertaken with support of GFCE under the auspices of the Counter Ransomware Initiative. So how can we scale and bring public-private partnerships to this counter ransomware effort? Is this need for there to be, or success is built upon trust and managing expectations, and the idea that TLP and those recognizing that TLP will kind of be the floor, at least in a particular community of trust, it has been a key to success, and its absence has been a key to failure on a range of levels. So we're delighted to see that, and kudos to you for bringing the interagency together around that. We are going to save time for, like, very briefly, a couple of questions if we have time. I think we have one online, but Steve, I was supposed to ask you about kind of, now that you're out and you have, the filter is off, sort of, what are you most kind of excited about? What are you most frustrated about? What are you thinking about for further implementation of the strategy?
I'm very happy to hear from Sean about the pivot or the update within DOJ policy around this disruption mindset. And actually, I was going to ask Sean as to whether that is public, or is that in an internal policy that's not public?
No, it is now in the Justice Manual. So that's the guidebook for all prosecutors. There's a section on disruption first.
And that's public, or that
That's
internal?
public. It's on
That's
our
public.
website.
Okay.
So that's one with every other minutia of policy that governs our lives. So you can look for the cyber sector. Just go directly there.
Excellent. So I look forward to hearing more about how government agencies are updating or adjusting their records management security policies to handle some of these boring but significant impediments. So I've got a lot to be hopeful for. So I will want to say a couple of things. One is that I posted to our organizers. Hopefully they can put it out to the full group. The blog post by Director Coker with Nick's announcement on the adoption or the guidance on the traffic light protocol in these contexts. So hopefully that goes out to the group. And then I do, when you're ready, Megan, I have a question from, I'm the designated person to monitor questions. We have a question from one of our online audiences. Okay. So Josh Corman asks, the National Cybersecurity Strategy was written and published well before the public revelation of lifeline disrupting concerns against water and other infrastructure by Volt Typhoon and the like, coming as early as 2027. How must the balance of the public-private partnership adapt with an appropriate sense of urgency? So if any of our panelists would want to kind of hop on, how does that change things? How does Volt Typhoon update how we think about this, and how can we act with an appropriate sense of urgency?
I will take first crack at this. So excellent question. Thanks, Josh. So I think that there's two things that I would say, right? One is, if you look at what the Office of the Director of National Intelligence has been saying in unclassified threat assessments they put out annually, and then you look at what we're talking about with Volt Typhoon, it shouldn't be a huge surprise to anyone, because doctrinally we've known that this is something that folks have been interested in for a while. There are, as Josh points out, some nuances to the particular threat that we highlighted there. And one of the things that a whole bunch of our cyber leadership went to the Hill to talk about at the beginning of this year. So National Cyber Director, the FBI Director, the CISA Director, Director of NSA and Commanding General of Cybercom, to talk about was the need to say, look, we are aware of some of these threats. There is urgency that is infused throughout the strategy and the work that we're doing. What maybe we have not been as clear on, or at least certainly this is something that the National Cyber Director, Harry Coker Jr., has talked to us about, is his feeling that this must be a much more public, like, we can't just have this within the United States government as an understanding of this threat that's out there, but we need to make sure that our partners in Congress understand and the American people understand. So I would say that, like, core to a lot of the work in the strategy is the idea that the government does have an understanding of these threats. I think a lot of people that are in the cybersecurity community have some understanding as well. That doesn't necessarily translate to the broader American public, and that is one of the reasons that he felt it was very appropriate. And he was thankful to the folks at a very bipartisan level in the House who held this hearing to just surface this as a particular issue. The other thing I will say is, like, yes, when we see folks going after lifeline sectors, anything else of that nature, absolutely, it recommits us to the complete spectrum of things that we need to do to improve our cybersecurity. That's why, yes, this is very important on a disruption standpoint. And, you know, I'll defer to Sean if he wants to talk a little bit about the announcement that Director Wray made on January 30th or so about Volt Typhoon specifically, but also separate and apart from disruption, there are other things that we need to do. And if you look at investments that we made in the president's budget request for healthcare cybersecurity, for instance, for the FY25 budget, that is also focused on the fact that, you know, we need all 5 of the pillars to be working in synchronicity if we're going to deal with some of the threats that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, I would add just very minor things to that would be, you know, from our perspective, I think we saw our role in that space was going out and grabbing the threat intel on these actors, on the Volt Typhoon actors, and pushing those out in partnership with CISA and others out to the network defenders so they could establish hunt guides, find this activity on their network. And while we're doing that, also try and knock down some of the obfuscation networks that these actors are using to get into the critical infrastructure entities to, again, help kind of push them out of the shadows to where the network defenders can identify them and see their activity going on and take mitigation steps. And so that was kind of our unique role in that space, which led to the director's announcement in January.
On that note, which is a note of urgency, and I think that's honestly kind of what keeps, I'll only speak for myself, but I think probably all of the panelists awake at night is the sense of there is an urgent need for us to get after this public-private partnership opportunity. And it's not only to defeat ransomware, it's also to defend lifeline critical infrastructure from today's threats, but also those down the road. As I kind of opened with, hopefully we will have fewer of those as we evolve to a secure by design and secure by demand and secure by default digital ecosystem. But until then, it's great to have this team on the side of the American people and our partners and friends. So I want to thank all of you for all of your service to the government, whether now it's out for some of us and in for continuing to be in for the two of you at the end. So please join me in thanking our panelists